Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to reiterate Luke's comments about thanking Forrest for inviting me in and Jeff for giving me such a kind introduction. So I am the Citizenship and Cohesion Advisor for the Borough of Waltham Forest. I've been in post for about 2 years, and the role exists essentially to support primary schools, secondary schools and sixth forms in meeting all of the expectations and the responsibilities set out in the Prevent strategy and also the Prevent duty. I've had a chance to have a look at the guest list for today, so I think that most people here are from out of borough. So what I'll try and do is just set a little bit of context. I'll talk a little bit about our local profile and some of the triggers that have resulted in us introducing a lot of the Prevent provision that we have in place. I think that what I'm going to try and do is give you information that you're able to take away to whichever local authority it is that you're working within, and start to think about how you can make sure that your provision is as up to speed as it can possibly be. And also stressing the point that this isn't something that institutions are expected to deal with in isolation. You should be seeking out support from your local authorities, from your councils, because they will have at least one individual whose primary focus is Prevent, and they should be able to support you meaningfully in helping you to meet all the expectations set out in the strategy. Just a bit more background. I was a secondary school teacher for 6 years in Borough, and when recruiting, the local authority wanted to be very clear that they expected somebody to have frontline experience, what it was like working day in, day out in a school setting, to make sure that any support that we developed was relevant for schools. And that will be the case in most of your local authorities as well, depending on the level of risk that exists and the activity that you see in those areas. Most of the people should have at least some background in working within schools. So it's not just a kind of policy approach, it is actually sort of meaningful resources, materials and advice and guidance that you can find useful. The first slide I'm going to show you is those people that have been through the RAP training will be familiar with it, but it's just setting a bit of context so you've got an idea about where we're coming from. So I'll just bring up the whole diagram, that's probably easier. This is the kind of the strategy tree that exists around the UK's counter-terrorism strategy. So at the top you've got contest. In the next few months you will be seeing a formal review coming out from the government where they have been assessing each of the 4 strands, or the 4 Ps as they like to refer to them, and discussing how effective they've been and whether or not this is something that needs to be improved, whether it needs to be expanded, or whether it needs to be taken even further and developed. The good news from my point of view is that Prevent, which you can see here, the tagline being engaging and educating people, is seen to be, despite all of the concerns around the kind of big brother and the teachers as spies aspect, it is seen to be something that is effective and needs to be developed even further. So whilst there have been some quite high profile criticisms coming out in the media and from certain pressure groups, the internal review, all of the evidence suggests that this is something that we are going to see happening more and more consistently. And therefore your institutions will be expected to actually be delivering this in an effective and a meaningful way. What this presentation should hopefully do is give you some clues and ideas about how you can do that. I'll try my best to not make it patronising and not dwell on the points that I'm sure you guys are already doing, but this is just about hopefully give you a bit more insight into how you can take it that next step further. Now, Prevent is designed to sit very much within the realm of safeguarding. If you look at the 3 other strands that we see here, they are owned by the police. And originally, the entire contest strategy was designed to be owned by the police. It was all about dealing with criminality. But because of the nature of Prevent, because it's actually pre-criminal, a lot of the sentiment was that the police were incapable of actually dealing with this effectively. And there are a lot of some of those high-profile cases of mismanagement which prove that fact. So it is now the expectation of the local authority to be leading on this particular strand of the contest strategy, and by extension schools. Why? Because you're educational institutions and you have that insight into the issues that those young people are facing and some of the concerns that might be being expressed. It's also because this provision should be universal. Unlike the place to be aspects that the presentation you've just heard, that's very much about dealing with the people that are in need of that support. Prevent is expected to be a universal module now. It's something that everybody should be engaging with. It's not a case of, right, we've got 4 or 5 disaffected young people, or we've got somebody whose attitude or behaviour has changed, we now need to work with them in the sort of the Prevent world. This is something that every single student, every single member of staff, every single member of senior leadership has to be up to speed on. There is no excuse. And when Ofsted go into schools, they could ask absolutely anybody. We've had incidents of Teach First teachers being asked about the referral pathway. We've had incidents of extracurricular clubs being analysed about how they're addressing British values. So it really is, to stick with the message that Luke said, a whole school effort that needs to take place. In the same way that you would be safeguarding against sexual exploitation or gang culture or drugs or any of the other issues, unfortunately, that our young people are having to navigate in their communities and in their lives. Now, in Waltham Forest, we had a number of triggers, which meant that when the Prevent strategy was first released as an advisory document, we realised that we needed to have something up and running very, very quickly. The first one was London 2012. Obviously, the scrutiny on the capital was huge, and the concerns about security and safety were also raised. The second one was the presence of far-right groups and organisations in the borough. So the EDL has marched in Waltham Forest twice in the last 2 years. That's not random, that's not by chance. They're looking at some of the key issues that exist in this borough around economic deprivation, around diversity, around hate crime. And they believe that they're going to get support, they're going to be able to recruit. So we needed to make sure that we were upskilling our staff and our pupils so that they're able to recognise this sort of activity. Because if you ask students in a school, what do you associate with the word terrorism, I guarantee you at least one kid in the room is going to say Muslim. But not one of them is going to talk about far-right extremism. They're not going to talk about neo-Nazis. They're not going to talk about some of the high-profile stuff that we've seen taking place. So it's also about making sure that we challenge those stereotypes. And then the third one was, unfortunately, the attacks that we saw happening both in London and also in Boston as well. And I mentioned hate crime, and what we saw was a spike in attacks as a result of these two incidents occurring. So we really wanted to make sure that we were addressing these and actually educating and giving the students a safe space to ask those questions and to develop their knowledge effectively. So in Waltham Forest, we had something up and running as of 2012. Now, in July 2015, the game changed ever so slightly, and I'm sure you're all aware of that the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act announced that from this point onwards, every single institution had to show due regard for the need to prevent people being drawn into terrorism. Suitably vague, I'm sure you'll all agree, but that then meant that every time an Ofsted inspection took place, every time there was a safeguarding review, you would be asked a question about your prevent provision. What does your policy look like? What kind of student engagement do you have? Are your parents being consulted? And we'll talk a bit more about this in detail shortly. But there are two key strands now that exist as part of the prevent duty, and they are institutional and individual support. Before the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act was announced, there were actually 3 I's that were included. The third I was ideologies. And the expectation was that you would also be working with schools and with institutions in the community to discuss the different ideologies that exist. The government made the decision to narrow this down to these 2 aspects simply because they felt that it was inherent in that work that you would be doing, that you would be talking about the ideologies that people were coming into contact with. Now, depending on the area that you work in, depending on the area that your school is based, the groups that are active, the kind of issues that your young people might be coming into contact with will be very different. In Waltham Forest, it's far-right extremism and Islamist organisations. And that's just the nature of the communities that we work with. But depending on where you are, you may face something different. The example I always like to use is in the West Country, where you've got much more animal rights groups who are much more active. We just don't see that in this area. So you have to try and cater the support and the provision that you have to what your local profile is. That is where you can speak to your local authority, and that's where you can communicate with the police to find out what the major risks are in your local area so that you're meeting those needs effectively. So in terms of individual provision, we've got 3 key players, 3 key stakeholders. You've got staff, your parents, and your pupils. So again, I'm kind of banging the same drum that Luke was a little bit earlier on and saying that the whole school approach needs to run through everybody that's involved. Staff, we're basically talking training, support, and guidance. How to address these issues in your classes. How to actually make links to fundamental British values, or however it is that you may choose to brand them. For example, I've seen schools call them, to use this school, forest values. That's entirely acceptable, as long as you're able to evidence that you've taught the students about the rule of law or individual liberty or the other values that exist. I do know them, I'm just not going to repeat them all for you because that's boring. But also about referral pathways, because what you need to make sure of is that your staff are comfortable with referring somebody on. Do they know what step 2, step 3 and step 4 looks like? Because if they don't feel reassured, they're not going to be willing to give up that information. They're not going to feel comfortable in putting that young person into that world where they've got social services or local authority people contacting them and trying to establish what their vulnerabilities are, and then longer term, what the interventions would look like. So it's really important that staff feel involved in that conversation and feel confident about how it will be managed further on. The same goes for parents. So consultation and education sessions. I mean, so many times we get parents coming in and saying, I just don't know what Prevent is. And so it's about reassuring them about the model that we have in place, the support that's available, and the intentions of the strategy. Because if you go by the mainstream media, as a parent, I would be very concerned if I heard that they were delivering Prevent sessions in schools. Simply because you hear one side of it. The media is not designed to be the mouthpiece of the government and their strategies, so it's our responsibility to work with those communities and with our parents so they also feel reassured and comfortable about what's being delivered. And they know that it's about helping those that need it. And then your pupils. So regular engagement, an embedded curriculum, that is key. And advice and support and provision both inside and outside. They may not want to actually disclose to anybody within the school. They may not feel comfortable. But there are a number of different organisations that they can access and that they can go to, which will provide them with the guidance that they need. The point about the embedded curriculum is crucial. I don't know how your institutions have approached Prevent work thus far on British values, but something that we've seen quite often is the drop-down day model or super learning day, where lessons are suspended and everybody does activities throughout the course of one day where they learn about the British values, box ticked. That cannot continue. Ofsted now will be looking for evidence of consistent delivery of these sorts of topics, running right the way through the school year, running right the way through key stages. Now, this isn't to say that you have to simply address every single one of these every single week. But if you can start to think about having a series of assemblies, for example, a series of tutor group activities that you can pull out and insert into different stages of the school year, then you can evidence that you are actually addressing some of these key issues. The other thing about Prevent and this entire world is there is constantly new material coming out. There are new issues emerging. I'm sure that many of you over the past week have had to answer questions around the US election and the fact that many people consider an extremist to now be one of the most powerful people in the world. So we also have to maintain that level of flexibility and be ready to respond to those questions and those queries from young people. Because let's be honest, we're living in an age where it's all very fast information. You know, they've got shorter attention spans and they need to be stimulated quickly. So having that bank of resources ready to go means that you're in a stronger position to meet those needs. In terms of, there's some evidence to support those, so research that has been conducted as well. In terms of institutional provision, we've got three key areas. So your policy development, partnership working, and referral pathway knowledge. In terms of policy development, these are the kinds of areas where Prevent should be referenced. They don't have to be in every single one. The most important is your safeguarding. Now, your local authority should have a safeguarding model policy in place, and it is absolutely critical that that includes a reference to Prevent. Waltham Forest certainly has one, and I would encourage you all, if you haven't seen so already, to find out what your local authority has in place. Some schools have gone down the risk assessment path, both in school but also outside in the local community. I mentioned the police being able to provide information around that. If you've got Safer Schools officers, please utilise their skills and knowledge. ICT programs, the online space is obviously critical in the work that we do and in the exposure that young people have to this sort of material. So your ICT policy should also clearly reference some of the potential risks. And some have even gone so far as to create an exclusive Prevent policy. I would argue that that's a little bit of overkill. You're not necessarily expected to do so, and if you've got something in your safeguarding and your ICT policies, you're in a strong position in terms of your safeguarding provision. But obviously it's the choice of each individual institution about how they approach this. Partnership work. As much as you can, work with your partners in your local authority. Police, educational psychologists, speech and language therapists. Use as many different people as possible. The more that you can show those relationships have been established and are meaningful and productive, the better it looks for the school too. And your referral pathway knowledge. So how are the cases managed in your local authority? It's not just a case of, right, we've identified an issue, we've passed it on, now they deal with it. What we want to try and establish, and certainly we have in Waltham Forest, is a strong link and a strong relationship running right the way through the referral process. From initial identification of the risk to consultation about possible interventions in-house or with specialist teams, and then the channel process and the actual care package that is devised. As much as possible, your local authorities will be looking to actually involve you in that care package process. Consultations about developments, and as much as possible, having you lead on the work that you're doing. Why? Because the relationship that you have with the young person, with the family, is always going to be stronger and more meaningful. So, some of the key measures for the pastoral approach, First one is noticing changes. And I know obviously I said I didn't want to come across as patronising, and this is an obvious one, but the crucial word here is change. So some of the key categories that we consider are these, and some of the key indicators are as follows. Now I'm sure looking at that list, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's pretty much 80% of the school. Okay, I understand that. We are not suggesting that if you have somebody that suddenly becomes sullen and withdrawn, that they are an extremist, they've been radicalised. But these changes, it's the shift in behaviour that can offer us a clue that this person is going through some sort of difficulty, that they may be more vulnerable, they may be at risk. And this comes directly from the Home Office, who have devised this information from the referrals and from the cases that they've had to deal with, or that local authorities have managed in relation to those that have been pushed down this particular path. So noticing a shift in behaviour is far more significant than somebody who has always, for example, been late. If you've got somebody whose attendance and punctuality is always terrible, that you'll have your measures in place to deal with it. But if all of a sudden that attendance drops off, then there's something worth investigating. There's probably a clue there that something is going on. Knowing the risks. These are the changes that we're seeing more of, the more prevalent issues that we're having to deal with. And this is obviously lifted from Waltham Forest profiles, but I thought I'd share it with you anyway. So the three key areas are the hate crime increase, specifically post-Brexit. We've seen a rise in Islamophobic and race and religious attacks. Online content. Anybody that went on the BBC News website this morning will notice that there is a news story talking about the amount of hateful content that young people are coming in contact with online. I don't know if the internet is working, maybe.
Yes, should be.
Shall I try my hyperlink?
You can go for it. See what happens. Looks good.
There we go. Okay, so you can find this on there, and just highlighting exactly what the concerns are. I mean, you can see here, 1 in 3 internet users between 12 and 15 say they saw hate speech online in the past year. I mean, that in itself is a very concerning statistic. We've done a number of local surveys, focus groups with students, and up to 80% of them will say that Facebook and YouTube is their number one source of information in terms of news. Again, to reference the US election, Facebook has come under massive criticism because of the fake news stories or inaccurate stories that they've been publishing on their sites in the build-up to the election. And unfortunately, that's often where our young people are going to find out more about exactly what's going on. Now, I've just brought this up. If I click on here, will it come back? Yeah, there we are. Yes, fantastic. And the last one I wanted to point out was lone actor attacks. This is the changing model that we're seeing taking place in terms of people being recruited to activities. So we're seeing less of a demand for people to travel or to move to particular places where they can get involved with extremist groups. The obvious one I'm referencing is obviously IS or Daesh, however you want to refer to them. And there is more of a demand for people to carry out lone actor attacks in their own countries. The obvious example is in Nice, that we saw the attacks taking place on Bastille Day. Now, when police officers investigated that individual, they found the first time that he accessed any kind of extremism-related content was on July the 1st. So within 2 weeks, he had decided that it was his calling to carry out this attack in the name of the Islamic State based on 2 weeks of online material and engagement. So the turnaround is a lot quicker as well. So how do we mitigate against this? How do we legislate for that? How do we plan to make sure that we keep our young people safe? It's about helping them to understand what they do if they come into contact with this stuff. Chances are they will see it, as you saw from that statistic. It's about managing it. We can put our firewalls in place on our blocks and everything else, but eventually they are going to come into contact with the material. So it's much more about how you manage it, how you deal with the situation, rather than just turning a blind eye. In terms of who we want to engage, you've got 3 different stages of people that may or may not be involved with the act of sort of violent extremism. In your centre, you've got your core group. These are the individuals that are willing to kill or be killed. They are the ones that are beyond any kind of support and intervention. You then have your secondary circle, which are your supporters, the crucial individuals that provide information on targets, to provide finances, and will look to recruit more individuals. And then you have your third circle, and this is the one that Prevent is most interested in, these sympathisers, people that perhaps do sympathise with the actions of the inner circle, can see why it is that they might be carrying those out, but are engageable, are reachable in terms of the work that we do, that haven't crossed into that criminal space, could potentially do so, but are still open to that conversation, that intervention that schools, local authorities and specialist providers can offer. So as much as possible, we want to be having that information being shared and reaching out to people whenever we can. The third one is to seek support. This is something that I think is a common misconception around Prevent, which is that teachers are expected to make a decision about who is radicalised and who is not. That is entirely untrue. Every decision about intervention and support must be made by an institution. And even then, the institution, senior leadership, safeguarding leads and so on, should be consulting with their local authority to get advice, to really know and really be sure that their referral is meaningful and is going to result in some sort of some intervention. The whole thing about teachers as spies is a failing of government and the Home Office in terms of communicating how the strategy should be implemented. But one thing I'd really want you to take away from today is that this is a partnership program. This is something that you should be getting advice on regularly, and if you're unsure, ask people that are responsible, that are specialists in this area, and that can help you make that a meaningful decision for that individual and their family. Ensure topics are embedded. I stressed this before, so I don't think I need to go over it again, but you can see numerous research and evidence to suggest that it's the most effective way for this to happen. And then the last one I think is the most important really, is focus on the positives. When we are delivering, when we are engaging with families, with staff, with young people, scare tactics and confrontational strategies don't work. This is about positive reinforcement, making sure that you are highlighting the strengths of identity, of community, of sense of belonging, of nationality. The more that you have those conversations and the more confident and comfortable young people feel to discuss those, to recognise their belonging to different groups, the safer they're likely to be. If all we do is talk about the risks and the dangers and who it is that's out there to cause them harm or is going to push them down a particular path, you tend to push the conversation underground. What we need to do is build up their resilience, give them the armour that they need to protect themselves, and the best way they can do that is by them having a clear, critical knowledge about these groups and what their motivations are. Outcomes, the obvious ones are at the top, so obviously the ongoing safety of your pupils, that's crucial, and your reputational impact. It is going to make your institution look like a stronger safeguarding institution if you are managing cases effectively. Often people say, oh, we're reluctant to refer because we don't want the implications of being an extremist school. They saw what happened to John Cass and Tower Hamlets that went from an outstanding school to special measures. Why? Because there were students posting information online? No. There were students posting information online, the school knew about it and didn't do anything. That's why they were pulled down. It's just like bullying. Every school has bullying taking place. You are measured on how you tackle it and how you deal with those incidents, and that shows how effective you are as a safeguarding institution. So the reputational impact is crucial, and if you're effective, it obviously highlights that. But there's also evidence to show a link between, intervention or prevention programs and academic attainment as well. So there's a twofold bonus here. All right, and the more that we're doing to actually encourage that emotional intelligence, get them to take risks, to ask questions, to challenge, to offer dissent, which is also really important, the more confident, the safer, and the more secure they're likely to be as individuals. I think that is the end of the show.